So we move on to our next story, Tanaika, and we find out that this story is 100% total fiction in every aspect. The title, Tanaika, is supposed to be an indigenous ceremony where you have to go out into the wilderness for 5 days and survive with nothing but a knife. There is no such ceremony anywhere in the indigenous world. So even the title of the story is fiction. The story was written in 1972. The author is Mary Whitebird. Sounds indigenous to me. Well, come to find out that this is a pseudonym or a pen name of a writer who's had an interest in Native American Indians in the 20th century. But she is not a she. She is a he, and he is not Native American. So I don't know how much more fiction you can get than that. So it tells in the story about the end of the Kaw people in Kansas, a tribal group that died out, supposedly died out. Well, no, that's not true either. The Kaw people still exist today. So here we have a story that is absolute total fiction in every possible manner. But it's an interesting transition from the realism of Jack London's writing style. We're moving into a contemporary form of fiction. If fiction does mean not true, I guess they took that to every possible point they could in this story. But anyway, the themes that the story talks about is again man versus nature, survival, coming of age, okay, from the transition from childhood to adulthood, old versus new. This is a very common theme in contemporary First Nations literature today. Changing times, absolutely true. And it suggests that our hero of the story is resourceful or deceitful. It's really left up to the reader to decide that. And should the ceremony be redone is another question that comes up at the end of the story. The story of Tanaika, we'll do a quick summary overview, starts off with the grandfather teaching the granddaughter and grandson how to survive in the wilderness. They have a rites of passage coming up, and he's preparing them for that ceremony. So one of the first things that he teaches them to do, surviving in the wilderness, is to find food. The berries, the nuts, the roots, even talking about eating grasshoppers. When I was in Japan, I tried some chocolate-covered grasshoppers. They were a little crunchy, no taste, but I wouldn't do it again. So anyway, they're kind of disgusted by it all. The two grandkids, they're definitely not going to be eating grasshoppers. So Mary, our heroine, uh, comes up with another plan. She goes to the local school teacher and asks to borrow $5. Kind of hedges around the real reason what she needs the money for. But she says that she'll pay the school teacher back by babysitting. So she gets her $5. It's the day of the ceremony. Her brother and she go into the wilderness. They take two different paths. They're in their bathing suits and they have a knife. And they have to survive for the next 5 days. So her plan is to go down to the river. She goes down to the marina where there are boats. And her plan is to sleep at night on one of the boats. Well protected, out of the weather, nobody's around, she'll be safe. So she goes down to the marina and there's no boats. They're all gone. Now what is she gonna do? So she sees down the road a restaurant, Ernie's restaurant. She decides to go in and use her $5 to buy some food. So of course she buys a typical tween or young teen meal, a hamburger and a milkshake. So she goes to the restroom. She sees a window that's partially open. So she makes sure that it's usable for later. She comes out, finishes her meal, goes outside. She waits for the owner, Ernie, to leave and go home. And then she sneaks in the bathroom window and carves out a nice spot on the floor for herself. She finds a radio, turns the radio on, has some tunes, feeling comfortable. The floor's kind of hard, but better than sleeping outside under a tree. She falls asleep, oversleeps. Suddenly, she hears a voice. The owner, Ernie, has come back the next day and says, "Hey, what are you doing? Who are you? What's going on here?" So Ernie knows by looking at her that she's from the Indian reservation up the road. And she tells Ernie the story of the ceremony called Tanaika. And Ernie's kind of appalled, a little appalled by how could you send kids out to do something like that? So he kind of takes care of Mary, goes into the closet, finds some old clothes for her. She is nice and warm. She can put the clothes together and make a more comfortable sleeping area for herself, and tells her that she can stay at the restaurant for the duration of the ceremony, which she does. So she sleeps there at night, and during the day she goes out into the nearby meadow and field. She picks some flowers, brings them back to the restaurant, and makes a table display for all the tables Ernie's restaurant, kind of a way to, help out and kind of pay for her board and room, so to speak. But Ernie's kind of a nice guy, and he teaches her how to make omelets and something called Ernie's chili. Okay, so I don't know if you know what chili is. It's kind of a Tex-Mex, a Mexican Texas food, a little spicy, beans and beef. People have contests for chili all over the United States. So it's basically American food. So she's doing pretty good. She's comfortable, out of the weather, well fed. He doesn't take any more money from her. The 5 days are up. She returns home, walks in the door, looking pretty as a picture, sees her brother lying on the couch, mosquito bitten, swollen face, dirty, red, exhausted. She looks like she just got up, from a regular night of sleeping. And Grandma and Grandpa are looking at her, wondering, where have you been? What have you been doing? Well, she doesn't lie. She tells the truth that she found a place to stay in a restaurant and kind of worked for her keep, picking flowers, and that's where she was for the 5 days. So they kind of, you really didn't quite do the ceremony correctly. Maybe you should do it again. Okay, and then the grandfather has a little, at the very end of the story, he makes a very interesting statement, and we'll get there on the next slide. But just as a side note, okay, so if you did that today with kids between the ages of I think they're 11 to 14 years of age, you'd be arrested. The police would be knocking on your door. That's child endangerment. You can't send a kid out for 5 days in the wilderness in a bathing suit and a knife and try to survive to make a transition into adulthood. So I think maybe, if you saw the movie 300 about the Greeks at Thermopylae, Sparta, yeah, okay. 2,000 years ago in Sparta, they might have done something like that. But 1972, absolutely not. Okay, so we'll get to what the grandfather says at the end of the story, which is really poignant for what's going on in First Nations transitioning from the traditional to today. So at the end of the story, the grandfather, thinking about it, should she have to take the test again, or did she really cheat, or what have you? So he thinks about it for a while, and he comes up with this final paragraph. And in it he says, "The grandfather said, 'But I think you are more alert to what is happening to our people today than we are. I think you would have passed the test at any time. Somehow you know how to exist in a world that wasn't made for Indians.'" So, okay, she passes the test. She doesn't have to do a redo or do the test again. And it makes a very important statement about contemporary First Nations peoples today. Yes, on the reservations, Native peoples try to renew their traditional lifestyle. But in today's world, it's an overwhelming task. You could see that in one of the earlier videos about Alaska, the struggle of that community trying to maintain a traditional subsistence lifestyle, and yet the world has progressed forward. This is a daunting task to try to maintain a total lifestyle in the traditional sense. So, what do we really have today? What's going on today with First Nations peoples? So, most First Nations peoples don't live on those reservations. Maybe about 25% live on the reservations today. The other 75% live all across America, urban areas, rural areas. They go to college. They get regular jobs. You wouldn't really know where they're from or unless you asked. So today we have an astronaut that's First Nations. We have several government officials that are First Nations. In the state of Iowa, there's a woman named Paulette Jordan. She was the governor of Iowa, First Nations, now running for a Senate seat representing Iowa in the 2020 election. We can see a real contrast in life in even the last 50 years in the two photos on the right. So the black and white photo is of that older woman 50 years ago, dressed in caribou made clothing, handmade. Caribou is a kind of deer living out in a rural community in Alaska. And here she is today, 50 years later, wearing store-bought clothes, okay, riding in looks like a bus or a van, and not a dog sled. And this is the world of iPods and computers and cell phones, and quite a transition in the last 50 years for those rural communities. Now, Jack London was one of the people that actually saw First Nations peoples living in their traditional lifestyle. Shortly after London's time, progress moves on. It's the Industrial Revolution. The First Nations peoples were pushed off their land and sent onto reservations, confining them into areas. They became kind of a welfare state dependent on the federal government for housing, food, etc. Eventually, through time up to today, those reservations have found that some of the land that the colonial powers moved them to actually had oil, and they were able to turn those revenues into a much better community situation. But that was not the rule. Okay, that was just isolated events. Some of the First Nations, especially up here this way in New England, have turned to gambling casinos, and they've turned their small rural communities into huge entrepreneurial enterprises backed by gambling casinos. So this is kind of a taste of what's going on today. And as we move forward from this story, we're going to get on the airplane and we're going to fly to present day Hawaii, some contemporary poems, and that's what we'll be discussing next.